few minutes, I'm going to be explaining to you what the GDPR is and some of its implications for us in the music industry. So you won't have to have that face when somebody mentions it. So we're going to cover what the GDPR is, why it's important for all of us, and then we're going to narrow the focus into looking at why it's important for the music industry, and particularly for artists and artist mailing lists. I'm not going to go into why mailing lists are important because we talked about that quite a lot already, but if anyone does want to talk mailing lists, it's one of my favourite subjects, so come and talk to me later on. Awesome. Right, so what is GDPR? The General Data Protection Regulation is a new piece of EU legislation, and it's a set of rules which will govern the way that organisations, including us here in the music business, collect and process personal data. Now, before I lose you entirely, keep in mind that it's important because it's created with us in mind. Us individuals, to provide us with additional safety measures in a scary online world where big companies know more and more and more about us. Think about your phone company, your bank, your doctor, your Nectar card, your Tesco rewards card, your Boots card, your Facebook account, your Amazon account, your Google accounts. All of these companies know more about us than we kind of even really want to admit to ourselves. So it's definitely important that there are security measures in place to keep our data safe from abuse. So, good old EU. They've been working on this set of rules for a few years now, and it was passed as law in 2016, but with a 2-year transition period. So it takes effect this May on the 25th. And before you ask, it will be incorporated into UK law prior to Brexit. So this is our new reality, whichever way you're looking at it. So between now and late May, if you are not already hearing these 4 letters on a daily basis, you can expect to, at work, in the media, online. I predict this is going to hit fever pitch by about mid-May, maybe a little bit like Y2K back in 1999, but the difference is that this time there are sanctions. 2 things to consider here. If you don't follow the rules, the financial penalty maxes at 20 million euros. You heard that right. And there's also risks to reputation to consider as well. Everyone is a publisher these days, on social media in particular, and it's just not worth giving anyone a reason to call you out for mistreating your fans' data. So GDPR, in terms of scope, more or less applies to any organisation that has customers or subscribers that live in the EU, which means that it's applicable to every organisation anywhere that has customers or subscribers living in the EU. I think it's pretty impressive that the EU can make legislation that actually has an impact on organisations the world over. Go EU. So the key concern of the regulation is the protection of personal data. And that includes everything you might expect, from names and email addresses right through to genetic or biometric data. So, what has this got to do with the music industry? Think about artist mailing lists, which we'll focus on, artist data, artist personal data if you're management or a label or a publisher, employee data for anyone who works for any company, your data, client data for companies like mine who invoice directly freelance. So I hope that you're with me now in realising just how broad the scope of this thing is. We're going to narrow the field down to just one use case, and one that I think is relevant, as mentioned, to many of us in the industry: the personal data that's held by or on behalf of the artist for their mailing list. So, our mailing lists, let's think about that for a sec. They may include information from any number of list-building promotions, download incentives, Spotify pre-saves, as well as direct-to-fan purchase data taken from the artist's web store, and ticketing data that's passed over from ticketing partners if you're lucky. So the first thing to do is to check your workflows and processes around personal data. Where is it stored? Who has access to it? how is it managed? Chances are that there are files all over the place, on this hard drive and that hard drive, maybe even on a disk somewhere if we're going back a few years. Spreadsheets from this or that promotion, marketing campaigns, ticket pre-sales. There's probably a master CV that was once up to date, but now is kept just in case you ever need to back up. That's obviously going to be out of date. Do what you can to streamline this data and keep it in one place. And think about putting a policy in place at work that governs how this kind of data is handled. Allocate the task to one person, maybe. And next, take a look at where personal data is being transferred to and from. Personal data should be stored in the EU. We're in the EU, so is our data. It's a big place. There's lots of places you can keep it. I don't think we're going to run out of places to keep it. It shouldn't be transferred outside of the EU. But this is where we run into problems, because the software programs that we rely on to run our mailing lists and to do marketing campaigns to gather mailing lists might be American, such as MailChimp. So there are exceptions to this no transfer rule, and I should point out that MailChimp are pretty sure that they fit one of those exceptions, so don't panic if you're a user. But there is a short list of countries that are deemed to have adequate safeguards in place, so it's okay to transfer data to them, including Canada, Switzerland, my home country, New Zealand. Woo, go New Zealand. So how did the data get there? That's the next thing we need to think about. How is personal data being collected, and how was it collected in the past? So for mailing lists, the key issue is consent. Sign-up forms must use a two-step double opt-in process. Anyone who isn't sure about what that means, let's talk later. Sign-up forms must have clear, specific language that's explaining that you intend to use the data entered for the purpose of sending news and updates from the artist, or whatever purpose it is that you want this data for. You need to spell it out clearly. So in order to determine what is clear consent, it's got to hit these 4 markers. It's got to be freely given. There has to be a real choice for the consumer in providing their information. It's got to be specific and granular. There's got to be individual consent for each processing purpose that you intend to use the data for. It's got to be informed. The terms of consent must be concise, prominent, and easy to understand, not buried in legalese hidden away somewhere on your website. And it should be unambiguous. There needs to be a clear affirmative action taken, no pre-checked boxes allowed. List owners have got to keep clear records demonstrating that consent meets these 4 markers. This is the kicker. What this means for existing mailing lists, right now at this moment, the list that you all might be thinking about, shit, is this my list? We've got to be able to show that there's a record of our existing subscribers' consent that meets these terms. Now, for much of the data that we're holding, given that it's been collected over a number of years in a myriad of ways, this is going to be impossible. And if this isn't possible, artists have got to refresh the consent. In short, this means asking anyone on your list for whom you don't have a record of consent to resubscribe. No one's going to throw rotten fruit at me for that. It is a scary and hard idea to accept, but eating the frog does have its benefits. At the end of the day, you're going to have a streamlined list of fans who actually want to be there, and that's ultimately the goal of a mailing list. And you'll probably wind up saving money spent on unopened emails, so woohoo, not all bad. Now, every communication must include an unsubscribe link. Chances are that's not too hard to do. You're probably using an email service provider that's handling that. Another part of this rule is that, in addition, individuals can now request for their data to be erased completely, not just unsubscribed. But I do have to wonder how badly you'd upset a fan for them to want that. But it is another thing to check with your email service provider. Now, as an artist or management or label who's in charge of a mailing list, you will be considered a data controller because you are the one who is making decisions about what to do with the data that you hold. Where are you using a service to manage the list or otherwise process the list? MailChimp, SendGrid, maybe Salesforce, Muziekgebouw, Bandcamp, even Pledge Music. These services will all be considered data processors. And this distinction is pretty important because each of them have different obligations under the GDPR. In the UK, data controllers must be registered with the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the authority in the UK that's in charge of data privacy, protection, GDPR compliance, and so on. Registration is usually about £35 a year, so it's not horrific, and it's pretty straightforward to get. For those of you who are not from the UK, there is a local data protection authority along the same lines in your country, I am quite sure. For example, in the Netherlands, that's what it's called. So just 2 more points to consider for our artists' mailing list use case. First, where personal data is being collected, you must have an updated privacy policy, which is available on your website. And it's also good practice to link to this the first time you email a new subscriber. And it needs to include details on the data controller, whether that's you. It needs to spell out the purposes for which the data is being processed. For example, to send information, offers, news, marketing messages. And it should also contain an explanation of the the subscriber's rights. Second, disaster planning. Be aware of what's required in the case of a security breach. And this might be a breach on your part, or it might be a breach at your processor. But data controllers have to keep a record of any breach, including the facts, the effects, and the remedial action that you've taken to address it. Now, in some situations, the Data Protection Authority, in the UK, that's the ICO, they've got to be notified. But in any case, the controller really does have to document the incident, just to cover your back. So, you're all still here. In a nutshell, that's the GDPR and a quick dive into how it will affect artist mailing lists in particular. Key thing to remember is this date of 25th of May. Get moving on it now so that your organisation will be compliant in time. It may feel a little bit overwhelming, maybe even a little excessive, but keep in mind that the whole point of GDPR is to safeguard the rights of the individual. And building a stronger relationship with fans, including taking good care of the data that we're entrusted with, it really goes to the heart of direct-to-fan strategy. Now, you can grab our GDPR checklist by going to any of Wicksteed Works socials, and you'll find a link there to download the checklist. Doing so, I should say, will also sign you up to my mailing list, which is or will be GDPR compliant by the 25th of May. Thank you so much for your attention. That is all.